So yeah, that might be a great working definition of what a nation is, right? A group of people, right? This Anderson talked a lot about this notion of peoplehood rather than nationhood, peoplehood, because it's the people that make the nation, right? Yet it's also connected to so many other things at the same time. So that's a good place to start. Say it again.
Like territory and stuff.
Territory, land is often important. Think about how often nations find themselves in conflict or even at war over borders and such, right? Borders can be very important to how a nation defines itself, right? But I think you're onto something with starting with this question of people, right? Peoplehood. Who else? What else is a nation? What might we say a nation is? Any other kind of working definitions of nation?
People who share a culture.
Share a culture, right? So we got people, peoplehood. We got this notion of culture. Some good vocab terms and vocab words for us. Again, think about how this is already helping us maybe think through what the United States is, or American culture and these sorts of things. Good. Anything else? What else comes to mind when you hear that term nation? You already mentioned geography, right? Yes.
I think like identity.
Identity. Okay, good. I'll put both identity and kind of geography or land up here. Both could, I think, be part of this definition. Good. I think all of those are correct. And he would argue that all of those are very much a part of his understanding of a nation, and what nation and nationalism might be. Again, we're ultimately going to be unpacking the United States. What does that look like as a nation? How is it constructed? How does it find itself in conflict and then in civil war? And then how does it put itself back together again? Now, think about the title, right? Often an author will tell you quite a bit in the title. Right? Often an author will tell you quite a bit about what they're doing in their title. They want to indicate some kind of information. So the title of this reading is Imagined Communities. Right? Imagined Communities. One of the things Anderson does well, I'll get to some stuff that I think he could have done better, perhaps, but one of the things I think he does well is give us some things that we do understand in order to try to understand something like nation that might be a little more difficult to understand or wrap our minds around. And community is going to be one of those concepts. We understand what a community is. Right? We all may live in a certain neighborhood or town, right? And you feel like you're attached to that community. Just use myself as an example. The house I grew up in San Diego is the house I currently live in now. So the house has been in my family since 1975. Right? I moved there when I was like 2. We used to have some neighbors when I was young, and we didn't know them very well. We lived there next to them for probably 30 years before they passed away. They weren't very friendly, but they weren't mean. They might say hello if I came outside. I think one time the wife sponsored me for a jogathon when I was a little kid, so I liked them. They had good candy at Halloween. That's about all I knew about them, right? But just because we lived next to each other, we shared a fence, we felt like we knew each other. Right? We felt like we had something in common just because we lived in the same geographical space, the same community. I'd never been in their house. I could have went in there. There might have been cages and crazy stuff going on, right? Every now and then you'll see this on the news, unfortunately. Every now and then it'll be like a horrific killing or something. And what do the reporters do, right? They go to the neighbors. Hey, did you know what was happening right next door? And the people are like, no, I had no idea. They seemed so nice. The only time I saw, the family was when they were going to soccer practice, or maybe the lady used to come out and work on her car on the weekends, right? But I didn't really know them. I thought we knew them, but who knew they were killing and eating people? How could that happen here? These shocking kind of things, right? Why? Because we felt like we know folks in our community, even if we really don't. Anderson is going to say that that's similar to how nations work. We feel like we know each other. We share a same, common space, a common governmental system, economic system, whatever it is, that gives us a lot in common, and that we know each other. Now, we're going to use this concept of community on several levels. We will use it to unpack specifically the history of the United States. How does this place go from being something else to becoming the United States, right? Having a revolution, a constitution. Right? Then within a couple of generations, it's in civil war. It becomes two communities for 4 years that fight each other. Then how do they put the pieces back together, become a nation again, and become kind of modern and become the nation we are today? So we can use it to unpack the history of the U.S. We can also, I would argue, use this concept to unpack what Anderson calls subnationalisms, right? Kind of smaller communities within the nation. Maybe gender could function as an imagined community. Race, class, region. Right? We know region can. North and South are going to fight each other in civil war. Right? They literally see themselves as so distinct, they are willing and able to kill each other for 4 years. So he's going to say that those communities can be quite powerful too. Now, this is why I think it's going to be such a valuable concept for us on so many different levels. We're going to use it in a wide variety of ways. So keep that in mind in terms of how we're going to use this concept of imagined community. How will we use this concept? Not just to understand nation, but we will try to use it to understand a nation like the United States. These are some of the vocab words that come up in this, the 7 pages. I just try to make a list, quickly. Some of these. Again, the first two are the title, imagined and community. We kind of understand what a community is. Now I would ask you about that other term. What does it mean when something is imagined? What does that usually mean? Someone says, oh, you're imagining things. What do people usually mean when they say that? It's not real.
It's like you're creating yourself.
Yeah, you're creating it. You're inventing it. You're creating it. You're making it up. And it's not real. Now, that has certain connotations to it. And maybe some of you were like me when you were growing up. You had imaginary friends. I had an imaginary friend, and my mom was like, oh, you're a little too close with that imaginary friend. Why don't you go make some real friends? I'm like, I like him better. He's cool. I don't fight with him. He's going to try to take my toys. If he does, now we have a real problem, right? But I'm cool with that. But he's not real. Go make some friends. Okay, fine. Now, normally when we think of something being imagined, we think of it not being there, right? Not being real. So imagine if I'm up here, teaching today, and I keep looking over at the door, and eventually you guys are looking at the door like, what is he looking at? Is he imagining things? And I'm like, you all see that? And you're all, what, with the dirt outside? Yeah, I see. No. You don't see the little 3,000-pound little baby elephant over there? You don't see it? You don't see her? Y'all are like, okay, 9-1, I think something wrong with him. He's seeing things. Too much cold medicine today. I'm like, no. I'm like, oh, forget it. I guess it's just me. So I keep teaching, right? I go over this way, and suddenly something hits me in the back and throws me up against the wall. Boom. You're like, oh, wow. Maybe there really was an elephant there. Right? I thought he was imagining things. But something was very powerful to pick him up and throw him up against the wall. Now, Anderson says nations are like that too. You can't always see them. You can't pick them up, walk away with them. But they're extremely powerful. They have tremendous power. Even if you can't pick them up and walk around with them. Now, we do find ways to pick them up and carry them with us. A flag, for instance, right, as a symbol of a nation. Pledge of Allegiance, these types of things. But he's going to say that we understand this notion of imagine, even though we tend to think of things that are imagined as not being powerful. We can't do that with nations. They may be imagined or invented or constructed, but they are going to be very powerful despite all of that. So keep that in mind too. In some ways they're very logical. In some ways it seems illogical. You talked about identity already. This notion that nations are constructed, historically constructed, legally constructed, socially constructed. They have economic systems, all these sorts of things. Right? We talk about race, class, and gender maybe figuring into how a nation is constructed, how it conceives itself. And Anderson also uses a number of vocabulary terms, a number of synonyms really for what a nation is or what nationalism is. Right, he talks about nationalism, patriotism, national consciousness, nationness, nationality. He uses any number of terms, but he's really talking about what a nation is and what nationalism is and why is it so powerful. Again, we're going to try to unpack this a bit for our purposes and see why and how this may be useful for us. So when I used to have this conversation back in the day, I would draw the United States on the board. I would try to show off my artistic talents, but as you can tell from my handwriting, I do not have any kind of artistic talent. And so it really became embarrassing for me because I would draw this lovely picture of the U.S., and students would look at me like, what in the world is that? Right? Is that a cow? Like, what is? And I'm like, no, it's the U.S. And they're like, well, where's Texas? You cut off Texas and Florida. I was like, oh, yeah. I try to fix it. So instead of doing that, I just decided to pull this image off the internet. So see what you think about this. And we're going to come back to this several points. You've already pointed out this idea of geography or land as important, right? I could just draw this shape if I had artistic talent. Even without the names on the various states, you'd be like, oh, yeah, that's the U.S. It kind of conjures up a certain image or certain feeling. Anderson is going to say that this is important for our purposes, right? This is important for our purposes, and we'll come back to this in a couple of the key quotes. But before we get there, I want to deal with how Anderson begins this article, because this is part of what troubled me initially about this reading. I started reading those first few pages, and I'm like, what in the world? What is this? Why am I reading this? Why was I assigned this? I got frustrated. I got angry. And it took me a long time to kind of figure out what was going on. Now, after some years, I've come to some conclusions about why I believe Anderson begins the way he begins in this article. And a lot of it had to do with specifically figuring out this idea of the nation. It had to do with that class that he was teaching 20 years ago. The end of nations, question mark. Now, we think or have thought that nations and nationalism was over with. Right? We live in a modern society. We have things like television that go beyond national borders and internet and radio and all these sorts of things. We thought nations didn't matter anymore. You have dual citizenship. You have international trade agreements, hyperspace travel. The world has shrunk, right? Smaller than ever before. Fly across the country in 4 hours. Right? So we thought nations were over with. You have a European Union and common currency. Nations don't matter anymore. I remember being in France for a conference in 2000 and turned on the TV and they were speaking English. I was like, whoa, okay, I thought I was going to get a little French soap opera or something, right? Went to a hip-hop club and it was like hip-hop in English. It was packed. Culture is a global kind of thing. So we thought nations were over, but every now and then we will realize that nationalism is still powerful. Nations do still matter. Borders matter. They often become very political. Right? And often how nations define themselves might be because of those borders. So what I think that Anderson was doing in these first few pages, at least from my understanding, is he was really trying to prove a very simple point. Nations still matter. Now, I just summarized that in 3 words. Why did it take him a few pages? I don't know. He's smarter than me. I can't figure this stuff out. But I think what he does is this. Anderson starts off talking about Marxism. Right? First few pages, he's talking about Marxism. He's talking about wars between communist nations and how socialism did this and that. And I was like, what is this about? Like, what is going on? Now, I do not fancy myself an expert in Marxism at all. I won't be teaching any classes on Marxism anytime soon. Some of you poli-sci majors could rattle off much more about it in detail than I can or will at this point. But just as a working kind of definition, Karl Marx believed that class identity and class conflict is what drives history. Class is going to be the most important identity. Class. He thought that the workers, right, those that produced, drive history. And he also believed that under our economic system of capitalism, that the workers were oppressed. Workers were oppressed because they were workers. Now, some of y'all may feel that way, right? You work for somebody like, man, I put in 2.5 years at McDonald's myself. I felt like I was an oppressed worker. I still have some burns on my hand right now from 1989 in the Big Mac toaster. I could show them to you. I felt like I was oppressed for that $4 an hour, which was the minimum wage at the time. So Karl Marx argued, you know what? Workers are oppressed. They're producing all this stuff for those that own the factories, those that own the means of production, bourgeoisie, capitalists, right? And they're not benefiting from it. And he argued that eventually these workers are going to figure out that they're oppressed. They're going to figure out that they have very little power as individuals, but as a group, they have a lot of power. If I decided not to go to McDonald's anymore, they're like, okay, thanks for calling in. We'll have somebody else in your job by the afternoon. I said, we'll pay somebody else your $4. I actually got 3 raises when I worked at Mickey D's. So by the time I left, I was making $4.35 an hour. Yeah. I was so excited, though, because that meant after taxes, I was making exactly like $4. I could do the math on it. Anyway, that's enough about me. Now, eventually, you may realize, you know what, it's not worth it. So if I just stop coming, they just fire me. But what happens if I work in a steel mill and all 10,000 of us decide we're going to have a sit-down strike until we get higher wages and better conditions? That's a lot more powerful than one person saying, I'm not going to work today, right? So Marx is like, you know what? These workers are going to figure it out, and they're going to launch a global international revolution of workers. They're going to come together as workers and realize that they're essentially an imagined community of workers. And that this class identity is actually more important than their national identity. Because if you're a steel worker in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Marx would argue you have less in common with the foreman in your factory than you would with another steel worker in India or China or Egypt. You have more in common as workers. And eventually you're going to figure that out. You're going to realize it. You're going to come together internationally. And you're going to put a better system in place. Marx thought capitalism itself was oppressive. And that ultimately the workers are going to put a different system in place, whether that be socialism, communism, some version of that, right? So why is this important? Well, this was a global thing. Eventually, workers realized it's not about your nationality at all. It's about your class. So we thought, ultimately, communist nations or Marxist nations would never fight each other anymore. Why? Because nationality doesn't matter. Nations are over with. They're going to have this revolution and all sing kumbaya, right? And workers are going to elevate themselves. Well, what happens? Anderson starts off this article talking about wars between communist nations in Southeast Asia and other places, and Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. And he's like, wait a second, this is not what Marx predicted. We're supposed to arrive at communism and then have this kind of global liberation, freedom. But that's not how it played out. Nations still matter. Nations still matter. Now again, could he have just said that? Probably. He's much smarter than I'll ever dream to be. But I think he purposely lays out all this other stuff to arrive at this position that nations still matter in the 20th and the 21st centuries. Borders still matter. Nations still matter. So that's why I said to focus your attention not on those first 3 or 4 pages, but on what comes later, right? And think of how we're going to use this as a tool. And how we're going to use this as a tool. So, for example, on page 3, a couple of quotes that jumped out at me, right? Every year, the United Nations admits new members, and many old nations, once thought fully consolidated, find themselves challenged by subnationalisms within their border. Again, this subnationalisms is going to be interesting for us. Yes, we're looking at the construction of the U.S., but we're also needing to look at some other important factors. How is race operated in our nation? How is gender operated, class operated, region, religion, any number of other factors that may be important to individuals and groups that have impacted the construction of this nation. The reality is quite plain. The end of the era of nationalism, so long prophesied, is not remotely in sight. Nations still matter. Right? Nations still matter. And then on page 3, he does something that I appreciate. Anderson is honest. He wrote a book on the subject, but on page 3, he's like, you know what? I don't have a perfect definition for you. Kind of like he did to us that first day in class. When we asked him what a nation is, he's like, He says it here. I'm driven to the conclusion that no scientific definition of the nation can be devised, right? Yet the phenomenon has existed and exists. So he's like, look, your guess is as good as mine. Now, initially when I read this, it made me mad. I'm like, well, why am I going to read the rest of your book if you don't have a definition? How am I supposed to have one if you don't know what it is? Right? But I realize now that he's right. There are many definitions. And we can all kind of contribute to this conversation on what a nation is, what nationalism is. It's subjective. It's based on perspective. It's contextual. It's any number of things. So that's what we're trying to do. Right? That's what we're trying to do. So on page 4, he says, look, the aim of this book is to offer some tentative suggestions for a more satisfactory interpretation of the anomaly of nationalism. He uses some big words, but we can break it down. Right? So we'll have some tentative suggestions, some working definitions of what a nation is, what nationalism is. Right? We want to get a better interpretation of the anomaly of nationalism. Basically, it doesn't always make sense. It may not always be logical in the way we expect, but we also already understand it. Right, so nationalism, nationness, as well as nationalism are cultural artifacts of a particular kind. Like you all said, culture. Think about what that term culture means. Last class, we looked at some kind of working definitions of culture, right? Especially those borrowed from anthropology, the way that people relate to their environment using certain tools to survive, that kind of thing, right? But culture is really another one of these umbrella terms. It means all kinds of things. When somebody says American culture, what do they mean? It might be music, it might be food, it might be family organization, it might be our official language is English, but that's not the only language people speak, right? So culture can mean all sorts of things, kind of like nation. To understand them properly, we need to consider carefully how they have come into historical being, in what ways their meanings have changed over time, and why today they command such profound emotional legitimacy. So that's what we're doing in this class. We're looking at how the nation was constructed, right? How it has come into historical being. How has it changed over time? And why is it so important? So what? Why is it so emotional? Why is it so powerful even to this day? Those two questions that we started with. What is a nation? What's nationalism? Right? What is a nation and what's nationalism? He says on page 5 to 6 here, it would, I think, make things easier if one treated it, nation, nationalism, as if it belonged with kinship and religion rather than with liberalism or fascism. So we tend to think of nationalism as political, like a political thing, and maybe even in your political party affiliation, for instance, right? Anderson says, no, it's more basic than that. It's both deeper than that and bigger than that at the same time. It's kind of like kinship or family connections. How might you imagine yourself as connected to your family? Right? Religion, how do you connect yourself to your God, your vision of God? These things are incredibly powerful, of course, but they're not all the same. Kinship is a good one. Maybe if you're like me, you might have a good group of friends. I talk often about my friends. I got a group of like 15 to 20 buddies that were my buddies from freshman year of college. So now, like 1991, a long time ago. And these guys are like brothers to me, essentially now, right? I'm not related to any of them, but I feel like I am, just based on our experiences, our loyalty to one another, right? A couple of times where things have happened where I didn't know if I was going to make it through that night, right? A couple of times folks had guns pointed at us, for instance. You learn a lot about somebody when you think you're going to die, right? And so I'm not going to say too much, but I'm going to leave it at that. They've proven their loyalty and they know where I stand with that as well. They're not related to me, but we feel like we're kinship. Maybe some of you have cousins that aren't really your cousins, right? You're raised with them, they feel like blood relationships. Anderson says we can use this notion of imagined community to understand that. How do individuals connect themselves to larger groups? Now this in some ways is a difference, right? Anderson would change the conversation about nations. Used to be, when we talked about nationalism, we talked about how nation one interacts with nation two. And it used to be when we studied nations, we were interested in how one government is interacting with the other. Think about, the president of the U.S. picking up and calling up the French premier or whatever it is, right? And negotiating a trade agreement or even conflict, warfare, trade embargoes, right? We're interested in how nations interact. Wars is one way that nations interact with each other, violently. Anderson says, yes, that's all very important. That kind of horizontal relationship between nations is important. But he's more interested in something else. How do individuals or people How do they connect themselves to their nation? Right? That connection has to be imagined in some ways. Let's use you, for instance. You're here in Los Angeles, California. You're about 2,700 miles away from the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Some of you may have visited the nation's capital, and toured the White House and all that fun stuff. Had a chance to do that. Some of you may have not ever set foot in the nation's capital. Does that make you any less American? No. Does it make you any less American because you're more than 2,000 miles away from the capital? It's not about proximity. It's not about distance, right? There's a connection that's imagined there, that's forged in a variety of ways, whether you live in D.C. or not. Right? Whether you live in D.C. or not. So we kind of understand this without even understanding it. I'm going to go back to that picture of the map. Anderson will argue that we often don't pay attention to national identity except when we need to, except when it becomes an issue. You probably didn't wake up this morning and take a shower and start brushing your teeth singing the Pledge of Allegiance or the national anthem. You probably didn't do it. Maybe some of you did. I don't know. Just felt especially patriotic today. But you don't have to do that to kind of get your day started, right? You're probably looking at the clock and thinking about traffic and how am I going to get here on time and these sorts of things. Right? But in a moment of national crisis, suddenly this gets brought to the forefront. Or for a variety of reasons, notions of citizenship or borders can become at the forefront of your mind. So I'm going to give you an example. Give you an example of when something like this might become an issue. September 11, 2001. September 11, 2001, I was preparing to move to Washington, D.C. I knew I wanted to study nations, so I'm like, well, I got to go to D.C. to do that. A lot of my dissertation research was in Washington, D.C. I was a student at UCLA at that time in grad school, and so I was going to drive down to L.A., from L.A. to San Diego to my mom's house, and I got a flight out of San Diego to go to Washington, D.C. I got a flight out of San Diego. I was going to land in the nation's capital, live there for about a year, and, come back and do my thing. The rest is history. So, of course, plans will have to change, right? Plans will have to change. But my plan was basically this. Since I had been at UCLA for a while, I knew how the 405 freeway worked. Some of you know how the 405 freeway works. Badly, right? And so what I decided to do was to drive at 2 a.m., right? I was going to go 2 a.m. down to San Diego. It's 135 miles to my mom's house. I could get there in 2 hours, and especially with no traffic. So that's exactly what I did. I got some soda. I'm always scared about falling asleep when I'm driving, and I left at 2. I got there at 3:45. Got there an hour 45 minutes. I'm like, man, this is beautiful. Which every day could be like this in terms of traffic. But since I had a couple of Coca-Colas, I was a little bit hyper. I walk in, I'm like, man, I got to catch a flight in the morning, but I'm not tired. So I turned on some bad television, tried to make myself sleepy. And it took a while. It's like 5 a.m. I'm like, okay, so honey, got to go to sleep. You got to go to sleep. You got to get up. You got to go to sleep. So I finally go to sleep about 5 o'clock. And about an hour later, what do I hear? A bunch of noise coming from my mom's room. I had a bunch of noise. Screaming and hollering. Oh, my goodness. Oh, Lord. My mom was a very religious lady, so there's a whole lot of old Jesuses in there. Right? And I'm like, man. Now, you know anything about me, I am a heavy sleeper at times. I can fall asleep standing up if necessary. So if I ever stop talking, I just stand here and stare at you for a few minutes. Please come shake me because I may have fallen asleep. I got sleep apnea. I got some other issues, right? So I can fall asleep pretty much wherever. And sometimes when I go to sleep, I haven't been sleeping well, I can be out. One time somebody was breaking in the house, and I was asleep on the couch. I didn't hear anything. My mom comes out like, what is wrong with you? I'm like, what? What's going on? She's like, somebody's kicking in the front door. I was like, oh, really? I'm like, did they get in? She's like, no, they didn't. I'm like, well, okay, good. I'm going back to sleep. I'm like, if they would have got in, then I would have got up and dealt with them. But I was tired. I didn't hear anything. Right? So this concerns me sometimes, right? This is concerning. So when I heard my mom making all this noise, like part of me is like, okay, something's wrong, get up. But the other part of me is like, you're tired. You just want to sleep. Right? My first thought was, man, my mom is being real rude right now. She is being really, really rude. She knows I just went to bed. Why is she yelling and hollering? My second thought was, I wish she would just shut. I didn't finish that thought because you never tell mom to shut up, right? But I was thinking for a second, I wish she'd just be quiet, politely. But then I'm like, you know what? Something's wrong. You got to get up. You got to get up. So I get up and I go into my mom's room. Right, I walk in there, kind of wiping my eyes, and I get in her room just in time to see the second plane hit the World Trade Center. Boom. I'm like, whoa. I'm thinking, why is she watching like a movie about planes hitting buildings? That's crazy. Why are you watching this early? What's going on? Why are you so excited about it? And I'm like, wait a second. This is the Today Show. This is the news. What's going on? Right. So then, of course, I'm glued to the television. Right? My mom is going off. She's yelling all kinds of things. My mom is saying things that are getting increasingly scarier. So basically, me and her sit down in her room and watch the news for the next 36, 48 hours straight. Obviously, I didn't get on any plane that day. Right? Nobody got on any planes that day. Right? I eventually drove out to Washington, D.C. I got my car, U-Haul, and drove out October 5th. A few weeks later. And I lived there for 9 months. But that morning, we're glued to the television. Now, Benedict Anderson would say, why? Why were you so concerned? My mom's house is 15 miles from the border with Mexico. I drove from L.A. down to my mom's house. In terms of proximity, in terms of distance from the danger, we weren't in any danger, right? Danger was 2,700 miles away in D.C. or 2,600 miles away, Pittsburgh or outside Pennsylvania, New York, right? 3,000 miles away. So why were we concerned way over here? Well, we know the answer to that. Why? Why were we concerned that morning? Me and my mom said in the room.
Because it was like an attack on the country.
If you see it as an attack on the nation and you're a part of the nation, then you're under attack. We understand this logically, right? Even though technically it's not a matter of proximity or distance in that way. Right? If that was the case, it'd have been much more dangerous if Tijuana was attacked. Right? That could actually damage my mom's house and kill us. But we wouldn't be so concerned about that, right? We're much more concerned about this. Doesn't matter if you're in Wyoming or Nebraska or New York. If you see it as an attack on a national identity, then you're a part of that nation, you're under attack. So it makes kind of perfect sense. We'll come back to this example here in a second. We'll come back to that because there are some other things my mom was saying that made me think. It made me think about this article in a weird way because I'm a history nerd. So that's what I was thinking about as I finally woke up. So another question, another quote here on page 6. In an anthropological spirit, then, I propose the following definition of the nation. So finally, on page 6, he's going to give us a definition. It is an imagined political community, and imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. Now, first of all he did there was tell us what the title is. What's the definition? What's an imagined community? Well, I knew that after reading the title. Well, what does that mean? So he does break it down a bit further. He gives us a bit more vocab here. Right? It's limited and it's sovereign. Right? It's imagined as because the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear of them. Yet in the minds of each lives the image of their community. Those are some pretty words. I told you, if Anderson was younger, I think he would have tried to be a hip-hop artist. He liked putting words together. But what does that mean? What is that? How does that make any sense? Members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members. So if there are 320 million Americans, how many of you have 320 million Facebook friends or Instagram, Instapot followers? How many of you have 320? Is Kim K in the room? Because I think she might. But the rest of us, no. I was so happy when I got to 200 Facebook friends. I wanted to throw myself a little party. I was like, yeah, 200. My friend's like, yeah, I got 1,500. I was like, forget you. You're not even likable. How you got 1,500? I got 200. You don't know 1,500 people, right? But do any of us have that many? Well, no. Well, does that mean we're less American because we don't know all 310 million Americans? You don't have to. Are you less a part of this class because you don't know all 42 people in the room? No. Are you less a part of the Mount Sac community because you don't know all 40,000? No. It's not about that. He says that we understand this on an intellectual level. You don't have to know everybody to feel a part of the community. We'll never know them, meet them, or even hear of them, yet in the minds of each lives the image of their community. What does that last part mean? The minds of each lives the image of their community. What do you think he's saying there? Some more pretty words, but it's worthless if we can't use it.
I feel like what he's kind of getting at is that, like, even though, like, I don't know a vast majority of America, I have this image in my head of what America is to me.
Good.
I cling to that.
Good. You don't know them, you have this image or this idea of what America is.
Yeah, like you think they're imagining a connection.
Okay. Yeah, in many ways we imagine this connection, and that, in some ways, I would say, makes it more powerful. Right? Makes it more powerful than if you actually knew all 300 million Americans, because it leaves room, I think, for that power to develop. He says we understand this even before we understood it. What he's going to do is give us a language to talk about these ideas, right? A language to talk about these concepts. Yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. So we have this idea, think about the founding documents, all men are created equal and these sorts of things. Now we know that historically that hasn't always been true. In fact, we know that the author of that document held slaves. So how are all men created equal if you own 200 of them? Right. We know that there's an idea and then there's sometimes the reality. Right. And we've had to deal with some of those complications and contradictions throughout. We've had to deal with some of those. Well, let's go back then to that map really quickly. Because I told you my mom was saying a number of things that were increasingly scary to me as I woke up. My mom would go in there, she's like, oh, Jesus, oh, Lord, we're at war, we're under attack. I'm like, Mom, calm down, like, relax, it's going to be okay. And then she said something really scary. She said, say, Connie, you're going to get drafted. I was like, wait, what? Nope. I was fully awake at that point, right? Why? Because Sekani is a bit of a coward. I've got a lot of relatives, friends, and family that served. Right? Much respect. I'm scared of guns, especially when they're pointed at me. Right? The few times that's happened, it's kind of ruined my day. Barrel looks like it. I'm like, goodness gracious. I see my whole life flash before my eyes, and I realize my life's pretty boring. Like, I should have done some more stuff. Like, if it's going to, like, so I'm like, oh, wait, what? I started looking at the map again. I'm like, wait, how far away from the border? Okay, I'll fight if I have to, but I'm a little scary about, such things. So I'm like, wait, what? Well, but that's not actually what grabbed me when my mom said that. It did grab me for a minute because I was doing the math. Like, man, okay. She said, we're under attack. Now, my mom was very patriotic, very loyal to this nation. Right? But my mom was also a history teacher for 4 or 5 decades. Knew this history inside and out, both the positive and the negative. My mom was a veteran of the Civil Rights Movement. She had marched with Martin Luther King and others. She had been to jail 9 times for nonviolent protests. She'd been beaten up by law enforcement. She still had bruises on her body. And she died at age 76 from stuff that happened in the 60s. As a child, I used to ask her, Mom, what's that mark? And she was like, no, don't worry about it. She never wanted to kind of talk about that part when I was young, because how do you explain that to your child, right, that has all this hope? And so in some respects, it was always a conflict for her. She never sort of whitewashed the negative parts of our history, yet she was also very patriotic. My father was in the Navy. So, it was a complicated conversation for her. So when I heard her saying, we're under attack, I was like, whoa. Just because she didn't usually frame things like that. She was always very critical of racism and sexism and classism and discrimination of any type, and an advocate for student rights, all these sorts of things. So it was always very conscious of her to point out how we needed to live up to our ideals, right? But at this point, none of that was what she was talking about, right? Right now she's like, we're under attack, got to deal with this. Why? Well, we understand that too. Anderson says in moments of national crisis, that becomes the priority. You put all these other things to the side, right? One of those quotes kind of talks about this, especially around pages 6 and 7. Finally, it is imagined as a community because regardless of the actual inequality and exploitation that may prevail in each, the nation is always conceived as a, I lost my quote, but I think I remember it, as a deep horizontal comradeship. What does that mean? Well, even if we know there are certain problems in the nation, certain complexities, certain contradictions, we still have the idea of what the nation should be. Still have an idea of what the nation should be. So what struck me that morning, here it is, I don't think I put it on your sheet. It's on page 7. Imagine as a community because regardless of the actual inequality and exploitation that may prevail in each, the nation is always conceived as a deep horizontal comradeship. So we think of it this way, right? Equality, even if that's been an ideal, something we've been working towards, but maybe something we hadn't necessarily achieved. So again, it struck me the way she was saying that, but in some ways it didn't because we knew why. I used to have stepbrothers and sisters for a while, and they used to fight like cats and dogs. They fought, especially my 2 brothers. I mean, man, you wouldn't want strangers to fight the way they were fighting, right? But if somebody broke into the house when they were fighting, what would happen? Right? They'd be like, hold on, stop fighting. They would go deal with that person, right? Throw him out, and then go back to fighting, probably. Mom likes you better, blah, 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 right? Once that external threat was removed, then they go back to dealing with their internal issues. Right? Nations often work that way. Nations often work that way. So Anderson says we kind of understand this stuff. Right? We kind of understand this stuff. It's limited. How is a nation limited? The nation is imagined as limited because even the largest of them, encompassing perhaps 1 billion living human beings. When he initially wrote this, he was thinking of China specifically that had closer to 1 billion. Now I think it's 1.7 to 1.8 billion, somewhere in that range. India's 1.5 billion itself. Beyond, has finite boundaries beyond which lie other nations. So nations have borders. Right? Part of what we know that this is the U.S. is because we know that there's something to the north and something to the south. Part of what makes this what it is. We could have our own nation right here. This could be our nation, room 1821. Right? We could have a flag. It could say 1821. We could close the door, play some music, have some pizza. Right? We have our own little community right here. Right? If we're too loud, maybe somebody from next door comes and knocks and like, hey, be quiet. You guys are too loud. And we're like, shut up. Well, this is our nation. Then they're like, hey, can we have some pizza? We're like, no, this is our pizza. There's something about the kind of us versus them, the kind of insider outsider, right? Are you a part of the community? Are you not? Historically, that's been an important sort of delineation. I missed one quote. Nationalism is not the awakening to nations to self-consciousness. It invents nations where they do not exist. So this notion of inventing or constructing them is important. A lot of folks have talked about the invention of tradition as another major text on nations or nationalism. Let's imagine, this term about it being imagined. What about this last quote? The sacrifice. Right? The nations are so powerful, nationalism or patriotism might be so powerful that it can require an extreme level of sacrifice. Right? Those of you that have signed up for the military know that when you sign on that dotted line, you might be asked to kill for the nation. Right? Even if you can't pick it up and walk around with it, right? It's imagined, it's not real in a sense, it's very powerful. Anderson says, ultimately it is this fraternity that makes it possible over the past 2 centuries for so many millions of people not so much to kill as willingly to die for such limited imaginings. So if we start at the end, yeah, it's limited. It's imagined, it's not real in a sense, but it's still so powerful that over the past couple of 100 years, millions will kill for the nation. Now, this quote conjures up a couple of things. Number one, when people hear nationalism, they often immediately hear extremely negative and violent aspects. Right? For example, National Socialism in Nazi Germany. Right? Think about how national loyalty will be marshaled by a certain leader and can be used for some horrific purposes. Especially when you can blame one group for all your problems and then try to eliminate them, which is what Adolf Hitler does. You can use loyalty to the nation to do some horrible things. One reason you have to be careful in terms of how these emotions are directed, how they're directed. So often, nationalism leaves a bad taste in people's mouths. But it actually is more complicated, right? Nationalist movements often have been used historically to free a colony, right? Right? Nationalism is what's going to create the U.S. We're going to decide we no longer want to be a colony of England. That's nationalism. African nations, Asian nations, Latin American nations that will throw off their oppressors, right, will use nationalism. So it's complicated on a lot of different levels. But there are some negative connotations attached to that. Right? Keep that in mind. But Anderson actually takes it a step further. He says not only is it powerful enough to perhaps require you to kill, even if you feel like killing is wrong. You might be raised in the church or whatever, maybe you're a pacifist, killing is wrong. But if my nation's at war, I'll do what I have to do. Right? A lot of folks would fall into that category. Some will not. Some say no, not even in case of war. But most, okay, I'll do what I got to do. Repent later or whatever. But Anderson says, you know what? It's even more powerful than that. Anderson says, you know what? Nationalism is so powerful that you're not only willing to kill for it, even though it's imagined, you're willing to die for it. You're willing to lay your life on the line for a capital you've never been to. Right? A president you may have never seen or met. That's how powerful it is. He says that's even more important, more powerful, I would say, than be willing to kill, but be willing to die. And I think that's true. If you think about your own life, right, you think that, okay, maybe I consider myself a good moral person raised in the church and all of that, but that's just as a mathematical equation. Right? That's just as a mathematical equation. Let's say there are 10 things or 10 people you might be willing to kill for. Right? And we're just doing math now, right? This is all hypothetical. So let's say there are 10 things you're willing to kill for. I would argue that the number of people you're willing to just die for is smaller than that. Right? There might be 10 things you're willing to kill for if you absolutely had to. But if you really think of it, there might be only 2 or 3 people. I have 2 kids. If it's a question of me or them, then I'm just going to lay down. You can go ahead and kill me because you can't have them. Right? But that'll make you question some friendships, right? Remember that cousin that stole that $20 from you? You're like, man, I'm not dying for you. Right? You still owe me $20, right? I'm joking, but you know what I mean? There's this higher level of commitment to just lay down your life for something unquestionably. Anderson says that's how powerful nations are. Even though we just got done talking about how they're created. They're imagined. They're not real. But they're very real, very powerful. Does that make sense? Makes sense. Again, this is what I think Anderson is up to. I think it's open to interpretation. You can decide what you think he's up to for yourselves.